The beeping of the heart monitor was the only voice in the room. I stared at my phone screen through blurred vision, reading the text message for the 5th time. "You chose your own path, now suffer alone." My mother's words. The nurse touched my shoulder gently and asked if anyone was coming. I couldn't answer because my throat had closed around the truth. My parents weren't coming. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. The empty doorway mocked me. Other patients had flowers on their tables, balloons tied to chairs, family members sleeping in uncomfortable positions just to stay close. I had white walls and the steady beep reminding me I was still alive, even though everyone who should have cared had already decided I was dead to them. Before I continue with what happened next, I want to thank you for listening to my story. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. I'd love to know who's sharing this journey with me today. My name is Tessa Lorne, and 3 weeks ago I thought my parents loved me. I remember the exact moment everything changed. We were sitting at the dinner table, the same mahogany table where I'd eaten breakfast before school for 18 years. My father carved the roast chicken with precise movements while my mother poured wine into crystal glasses that caught the chandelier light. I cleared my throat and said the words I'd been practicing for months. I told them I'd been accepted to the Portland Institute of Fine Arts. I told them I was going to be a painter. The knife in my father's hand stopped moving. The silence that followed felt like falling. My father, Preston Lorne, had built his law firm from nothing into something that made other lawyers nervous. He expected the same building from me. Marriage to Nathan Caldwell, son of his biggest client. A position at Lorne & Associates. 2.5 children and a house in the right neighborhood. My whole life had been mapped out before I could even hold a pencil, but the first time I held one, everything changed. Art was the only language that made sense to me. It was the only time I felt like I was speaking my own words instead of repeating someone else's script. My father called it a phase. My mother called it rebellion. I called it breathing. The argument lasted 3 hours. My father's voice climbed higher with every minute, rattling the frames on the walls. He called me selfish, ungrateful, stupid. He said artists die poor and forgotten, that I was throwing away a golden future for pipe dreams and paintbrushes. My mother sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap like she was praying. When I finally stood up from the table and said I was going regardless of their blessing, my father pointed at the door. "Then leave now. Don't come back until you're ready to apologize and act like a Lorne." I looked at my mother, waiting for her to say something, anything. She looked away. That was her answer. I packed in darkness, shoving clothes and art supplies into a suitcase I'd hidden under my bed for exactly this moment. My hands shook as I zipped it closed. I expected my mother to knock on the door, to slip inside and whisper that everything would be okay, that my father would calm down. She never came. At 2 a.m, I crept down the stairs, each creak sounding like thunder. I paused at the front door and looked back at the house I'd grown up in. The photos on the wall showed a smiling family. I wondered if that girl in the pictures had ever really existed, or if she'd just been playing pretend. My new life started in a 4th-floor walk-up apartment I shared with 2 other art students. The paint was peeling, the pipes hummed strange songs at night, and my bedroom was barely big enough for a mattress. But it was mine. I worked mornings at a coffee shop that smelled like burnt beans and broken dreams, then spent afternoons in the studio painting until my hands cramped. My teacher, Professor Marcus Hale, said my work had something raw in it, something that grabbed people by the throat and refused to let go. I didn't tell him it was because I was painting my way through abandonment. Every brushstroke was a conversation with parents who'd stopped listening. I tried calling home 6 times in the first month. The first 3 calls went to voicemail. The 4th time, my father answered, listened to me say hello, then hung up without speaking. The 5th time, my mother picked up. I could hear her breathing on the other end, could picture her standing in the kitchen with sunlight streaming through the window she always kept spotless. I said, "Mom, please, I miss you." She was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she whispered, "You made your choice, Tessa," and the line went dead. I didn't try a sixth time. I deleted their numbers and told myself it was easier this way. My birthday came in October, 20 years old, and I celebrated by eating ramen noodles alone in my apartment while rain hammered against the window. My phone stayed silent all day. No cards, no calls, no acknowledgement that I'd ever been born. My roommate found me crying over my sketchbook and wrapped me in a hug that smelled like paint thinner and kindness. She didn't ask questions, just held on until the shaking stopped. That night, I painted a portrait of a girl with no face standing in an empty room. I titled it Invisible and submitted it to a student exhibition. It sold for $300 to a woman who said it made her feel seen. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March. I was riding my bike home from the studio, my portfolio strapped to my back, my mind running through color palettes for my next piece. The rain had just started, turning the streets slick and silver. I saw the delivery van run the red light half a second before impact. There wasn't time to swerve, wasn't time to scream, just the crunch of metal, the sensation of flying, then darkness that swallowed everything whole. I woke up 3 days later with tubes in my arms, bandages wrapped around my ribs, and pain that felt like my body had been torn apart and badly reassembled. The doctor explained my injuries in a calm voice meant to keep me from panicking. 3 broken ribs, fractured left wrist, severe bruising across my legs and back, mild concussion. I'd need weeks of recovery, possibly months of physical therapy. My drawing hand, my right hand, had been crushed in the impact. They'd done surgery to rebuild it, inserting pins and screws to hold the bones together. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive. I stared at my bandaged hand and thought about never painting again. Lucky felt like the wrong word. Lucky felt like a lie people told to make tragedy sound bearable. The hospital wanted an emergency contact. I gave them my mother's number because muscle memory is stronger than pride. Because somewhere deep down I believed that surely this would be enough. Surely nearly dying would crack open whatever wall they'd built around their hearts. The nurse made the call from the hallway. I watched through the doorway as her expression shifted from professional to confused to something that looked like pity. She came back into my room and touched my shoulder. She said you're not her responsibility anymore. She said you chose to leave, so you're on your own. The heart monitor picked up speed. Betrayal has a sound, and it sounds like steady beeping climbing toward panic. Days melted into each other. Physical therapists moved my legs, nurses changed bandages, doctors checked charts and nodded with satisfaction at my healing. I smiled when they told me I was doing great, that my progress was remarkable, that I'd be back on my feet soon. I didn't tell them that every night after visiting hours ended, after the fluorescent lights dimmed and the hallways went quiet, I cried until my pillow was soaked. I watched other patients get visitors, husbands bringing flowers, mothers fussing over blankets, children coloring cards at bedside tables. My doorway stayed empty. The absence of my parents took up more space than any visitor ever could have. A physical therapist named Eli worked with me 3 times a week. He had kind eyes and tattoos running up both arms, each one telling a story he'd share if you asked. He never asked about my family. Maybe the nurses had warned him, or maybe he just recognized the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being abandoned by the people who created you. Instead, he talked about strength, about how the body remembers how to heal even when the mind wants to give up. He stayed late on his own time, helping me relearn how to walk without limping, how to grip a pencil again, even though my hand screamed with every movement. 6 weeks into recovery, Eli found me crying over a sketchbook. My right hand couldn't hold the pencil steady. Every line came out shaky and wrong, nothing like the fluid strokes I used to command without thinking. I'd tried drawing my mother's face from memory, but it came out distorted, like looking at her through broken glass. Eli sat down beside my bed and asked if he could see my work. I showed him the painting on my phone, pieces I'd done before the accident. He studied them for a long time, then looked at me. "This is real. This is important. You can't let pain steal this from you." Something in his voice made me believe him. Eli suggested I try drawing with my left hand while my right one healed. It felt impossible at first, like learning a new language where every word came out backwards. But slowly, painfully, something started to happen. The shakiness that made my drawings look broken also made them look raw, vulnerable, alive in ways my technically perfect work had never been. I drew what I felt: a girl in a hospital bed with an empty doorway, parents turning their backs, hands reaching into darkness and finding nothing. I drew betrayal and abandonment and the specific ache of loving people who'd learned how to unlove you. Eli asked if he could post one of my drawings online. "Just one," he said, to a community of artists he followed. I said yes, because what did I have to lose that hadn't already been taken? He chose the drawing of the empty doorway, the one I'd titled Waiting for Ghosts. He posted it that night. By morning, my phone was exploding with notifications. Strangers were sharing my work, commenting with their own stories of family rejection, of choosing themselves and paying the price. Someone wrote, "This is my childhood in a single image." Someone else said, "You drew my pain." I read every comment and cried, but this time it felt different. This time I wasn't crying alone. The drawing went viral. Within a week, I had 15,000 followers on social media. Art blogs picked up the story. A journalist reached out, asking to interview me about my work. I said yes, and we talked for 2 hours about pain as art, about how sometimes the worst moments in life crack you open wide enough for truth to finally spill out. She asked where my inspiration came from. I hesitated, then told her about the accident, about the text message, about parents who taught me that love comes with conditions and can be revoked the moment you stop following their script. The article published 3 days later. It was titled, "The Art of Abandonment." My parents' friend saw the article first, Mrs. Harrington, who'd known me since I was 6, who'd watched me grow up across Sunday dinners and charity galas. She sent it to my mother with a message I'd never see but could easily imagine. By evening, my mother had read every word. My father read it over her shoulder, his face getting redder with each paragraph. I know this because my cousin told me later, after everything else happened. My father called it slander. My mother said nothing, just stared at the photo of me that accompanied the article. In it, I was smiling despite the hospital gown, despite the bandages, despite everything. My cousin said my mother looked at that smile for a long time. The interview opened doors I'd thought were permanently locked. A gallery owner in Seattle reached out, offering me a spot in a group exhibition. A prestigious art magazine wanted to feature my work in their Emerging Artists issue. An arts foundation offered me a grant to continue creating while I recovered. The money meant I could quit the coffee shop job I'd been dreading returning to. It meant I could focus on healing and painting. It meant I could breathe without constantly calculating if I'd make rent. My father had always said I'd starve as an artist. Every new opportunity felt like a direct conversation with his ghost, proving him wrong one contract at a time. 3 months after the accident, a gallery in downtown Portland offered me something impossible, a solo exhibition. My own show, my name on the walls, my work standing alone instead of hidden in the crowd of a group show. I said yes before they finished asking. The opening was scheduled for October, 8 months away. 8 months to create enough pieces to fill a gallery, to transform pain into beauty, to prove that everything I'd lost had been worth it. I painted every day, even when my hand ached, even when the physical therapy left me exhausted. Each piece told part of the story I'd been too afraid to tell out loud. My father sent a text message 4 months after the accident. Just 4 words. "We should talk soon." I stared at those words for 20 minutes, my heart hammering against my healing ribs. 4 months of silence, and suddenly he wanted to talk. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "I was wrong," just an expectation that I'd come running the moment he decided he was ready. My hands shook as I typed and deleted. Finally, I left it on read. Let him wait the way he'd made me wait in that hospital room. Let him wonder the way I'd wondered if I'd ever be worth coming back for. I put my phone face down and went back to painting. The night of my exhibition opening, I stood in the gallery surrounded by my work. 23 paintings, each one a piece of my story, hung on white walls under perfect lighting. People I'd never met studied my pain like it was beautiful, which I guess it was, in the way broken things can be beautiful if you look at them right. Eli was there, dressed in a button-down shirt instead of his usual therapy scrubs. My roommates came with flowers. Professor Hale brought colleagues. Strangers bought pieces and thanked me for making them feel less alone. I was floating on champagne and validation when I saw them walk through the door. My mother wore pearls and a navy dress that probably cost more than my entire month's rent. My father stood beside her in the suit he wore to court, the one that made opposing lawyers nervous. They moved through the gallery like they owned it, studying each painting with expressions I couldn't read. People whispered because several of the pieces were clearly about them, about rejection and abandonment, about parents who choose pride over love. They stopped in front of the centerpiece, a large canvas I'd titled "Empty Doorway." My mother's hand went to her throat. My father's jaw clenched. They stood there for 5 full minutes before they finally approached me. My mother spoke first, her voice soft enough that only I could hear. "Tessa, we're proud of you. This is remarkable." My father added, "Perhaps we can discuss family matters privately later." The words were right, but they tasted wrong. I could see the calculation behind my father's eyes, could see him already spinning how this looked, his daughter the successful artist, how it reflected on him. My mother's pride felt like it came with conditions attached. They weren't here because they loved me, they were here because I'd become visible in a way they couldn't ignore. I smiled for the cameras that had started to flash around us, but my eyes stayed cold. "I'm glad you could make it," I said, meaning none of it. Later, behind the gallery where delivery trucks unloaded during the day, I finally let myself say what I needed to. My parents followed me out, probably thinking this was where I'd forgive them, where we'd hug and pretend the past year hadn't happened. Instead, I looked my father in the eyes and said, "You left me to die in that hospital. You chose punishment over love, and you lost me." He started to argue, his lawyer instincts kicking in, but I kept talking. "You taught me that family isn't built on fear, it's built on showing up, and you never did." My mother had tears in her eyes, but I was done collecting her tears like they meant something. I walked back inside, and this time I was the one who left them standing alone. My mother sent a letter 2 weeks later. Inside was a photo of me at age 7, covered in paint, grinning at the camera with missing front teeth. The note read, "I didn't stop your father. I should have. I'm sorry." I read it 3 times, then held it over the kitchen sink and set it on fire with a match. I watched my mother's apology curl into ash, watched the photo blacken and disappear. Sorry didn't bring her to the hospital. Sorry didn't answer those phone calls. Sorry was just a word people used when the consequences of their actions finally caught up with them. I washed the ashes down the drain and felt lighter than I had in months. With money from the exhibition and the grant, I put a down payment on a small house near the art district. It had 2 bedrooms, tall windows that drank in morning light, and a backyard I immediately started filling with plants. I turned the 2nd bedroom into a studio, painted the walls white, set up my easel where the light hit perfectly at 3 in the afternoon. I hung one of my hospital drawings on the wall, the one titled Alone, not to remind myself of pain, but to remember what I'd survived, what I'd built from ashes. This house was mine in a way my parents' house never had been. Every corner breathed with my choices, my voice, my freedom. 6 months after the exhibition, I received an invitation to speak at the National Art Therapy Conference in my hometown. The event would be broadcast live, streamed to thousands of viewers, covered by local news. I stared at the invitation for 3 days before saying yes. Part of me wanted to avoid my hometown forever, to let my parents exist only as characters in my origin story. But another part of me, the part that had learned to turn pain into power, knew this was important. I could speak my truth on a stage big enough that it couldn't be ignored. I could close the chapter in the place where it had opened. I accepted the invitation and started writing my speech. The morning of the conference, I stood backstage in a dress the color of sunset, my hands steadier than they'd been in months. Through a gap in the curtain, I could see the audience filling the auditorium. Artists, therapists, students, journalists, and in the third row, perfectly positioned, sat my parents. My father's face was unreadable. My mother's hands were folded in her lap the same way they'd been that night at dinner, when everything ended. I wondered if she'd chosen that seat deliberately, close enough to hear every word, far enough to pretend she wasn't devastated by them. The moderator touched my shoulder. "You're on in 2 minutes." I nodded and stepped toward the stage lights. My speech lasted 17 minutes. I talked about pain as a catalyst, about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you cracks you open wide enough for your real self to finally escape. I told my story without naming names, but everyone who knew me knew exactly who I was talking about. "When people abandon you," I said, my voice carrying to the back row, "you have 2 choices. You can break or you can build." I chose to build. I built a life from the rubble of rejection. I built art from abandonment. I built myself into someone I'm proud to be, even if the people who raised me never learned how to be proud of who I actually am instead of who they wanted me to become. The speech ended with standing ovation that lasted 3 minutes. Cameras flashed, people cried. The moderator hugged me as I walked off stage. But I was watching my parents. My mother had tears streaming down her face, her perfect composure finally shattered. My father sat frozen, staring straight ahead like he'd been turned to stone. A journalist approached them after, microphone ready, asking for comment. My father stood abruptly and walked out. My mother stayed seated, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking. I watched from the wings and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just a quiet sense of completion. I'd said what needed saying. What they did with it was no longer my responsibility. The video of my speech went viral overnight. By morning, it had 500,000 views. By evening, over 2 million. News outlets picked it up. Psychology Today wrote an article. Podcasts reached out for interviews. My social media exploded with messages from people sharing their own stories of family estrangement, of choosing themselves and surviving the fallout. Someone started a hashtag about breaking cycles of toxic family expectations. My phone never stopped buzzing. Through it all, my parents stayed silent. No calls, no texts, no letters. The silence felt different this time. Before, their silence had been punishment. Now, it just felt like acceptance that we'd both moved on to separate lives. 2 weeks after the speech, I sent my parents one final message. Not words, just a photograph. In it, I stood in front of my childhood home, the house where I'd learned to paint in the attic, where I'd been told to leave, where I'd become invisible. I was smiling in the photo, genuinely smiling, standing on the front lawn holding a folder. Inside that folder were closing documents. My father's firm had suffered losses, bad investments, clients leaving. They'd been too proud to tell anyone they were struggling. I'd found out through public records while researching property near my hometown. I'd bought the house at auction, paid cash. Every dollar earned from selling my pain back to the world. I didn't include an explanation with the photo. I didn't need to. My mother called 30 seconds after I sent it. I didn't answer. She called again. 15 missed calls before she finally left a voicemail. Her voice was destroyed, broken by crying, barely understandable. "Tessa, please call me back. I need to explain. We're sorry. We're so sorry. Please don't do this. That house is all we have left. Please." I saved the voicemail, but didn't respond. My father sent a text an hour later, and even through the typed words, I could feel his rage. This is beyond cruelty. You've proven you're exactly as heartless as I always suspected. I blocked his number, my mother's too. I'd already said everything that needed saying. Anything more would just be repeating myself to people who'd proven they only listened when it benefited them. I didn't kick my parents out immediately. I gave them 60 days to find somewhere else to live, which was more grace than they'd shown me bleeding in a hospital bed. I had my lawyer handle all communication. They tried to fight it, hired their own attorney, claimed I was doing this out of spite. My lawyer sent them copies of the text message my mother had sent when I was hospitalized, the one about suffering alone. He sent them articles about my speech, about the art I'd created from their rejection. The case never made it to court. Even my father, with all his legal experience, knew he couldn't win this. They moved out quietly, and I never asked where they went. I turned my childhood home into something beautiful. The first thing I did was tear down the formal dining room where my life had ended over roast chicken and crystal glasses. I opened up the space, added windows, turned it into a community art studio. I painted the walls in colors my mother would have hated, bright and alive and refusing to apologize for taking up space. I installed easels and supply shelves. I hung my own work on the walls, not as decoration, but as proof that the girl who'd been told to leave had eventually come back on her own terms. I called it the Lorne Community Art Center, keeping the family name but transforming what it stood for. The center opened in spring, 1 year and 2 months after the accident that had broken me open. I offered free classes to kids who couldn't afford art supplies, to adults who'd been told they weren't creative, to anyone who needed a space where they could make messy, imperfect, beautiful things without judgment. Eli volunteered as an accessibility coordinator, making sure people with physical limitations could still participate. Professor Hale taught an advanced painting course. My roommates ran workshops on different mediums. We filled the house with voices and laughter and the smell of paint and possibility. The empty rooms where I'd grown up silent and invisible now echoed with the sound of people being seen. One afternoon, 6 months after opening, I found a woman standing outside the center, just staring at the building. She looked familiar in a way I couldn't place, something about her eyes. When I approached, she turned, and I realized she was holding a painting, one of mine, from my first exhibition, the one titled Empty Doorway. She'd bought it that night. She introduced herself as Nora and said she'd been following my work since the article. Then she told me her story. Her parents had disowned her for being gay. She hadn't spoken to them in 7 years. My art had helped her understand she wasn't alone. She'd driven 6 hours just to see the center, to see what I'd built from pain. We talked for 2 hours, and when she left, she was smiling. That's when I understood the point of all of it. Not revenge, connection, transformation, proof that abandoned things can grow into something stronger than whatever tried to destroy them. That night, I painted until sunrise, and every stroke felt like freedom. I'd chosen my path, walked it alone when I had to, and built something my parents could never take away. Not because I was heartless, but because I'd finally learned my heart belonged to me.